How did just 500 Spaniards destroy the most powerful empire in the New World?
In 1519, Hernán Cortés's expedition landed on the coast of Mexico.
They had almost no food. Behind them, the ocean roared. To prevent the soldiers from fleeing back to Cuba, Cortés issued a ruthless order. He commanded that the bottoms of their own ships be breached. The Spanish fleet sank. This act instantly cut off all routes of retreat.
Now the conquistadors had only one option left.
They had to press forward, deep into a hostile and vast continent. A wall of dense tropical jungle stood before the Spaniards. Scouts returned every day with alarming news. Hidden deep within the mainland were stone cities and hundreds of thousands of Indian warriors. The local climate immediately took its toll on the expedition. The stifling heat and humidity quickly wore the men down. Heavy steel cuirasses became scorching hot under the blazing sun.
The armor turned every step the soldiers took through the swamps into a veritable torture.
Every night, the conquistadors built a fortified camp. They furiously cut down the dense undergrowth around the campsite. Cortés ordered that the enemy be deprived of any cover for an ambush. Reinforced sentries were posted along the camp's perimeter. The darkness of the tropical forest frightened the Spaniards with its sharp and unfamiliar sounds. Crossbowmen stood for hours in wild tension. A single mistake by a sentry could lead to the sudden death of the entire detachment. Soon, the conquistadors reached the first large Indian settlements. These encounters took place in an atmosphere of fear and mutual distrust. Only the interpreters saved the Spaniards' lives. They convinced the local chiefs of Cortés' peaceful intentions. The commander carefully concealed just how small and vulnerable his army was. In those first weeks, cunning and deception replaced steel swords for the conquistadors.
Then the Aztec ruler Moctezuma made a fatal mistake.
He sent Cortés chests full of gold. The emperor hoped that the rich gifts would force the Spaniards to return across the sea. But this move had the exact opposite effect. The glitter of the treasures only stoked the soldiers' greed. The conquistadors immediately melted down the exquisite Indian jewelry into convenient, heavy ingots. Now the expedition moved much more aggressively. The speed of the march depended solely on supplies of fresh water and corn. The Spaniards trudged stubbornly from one village to the next. They slowly climbed toward the borders of the Central Plateau. It was there that the rich heart of the Aztec Empire lay. With every kilometer traveled across foreign land, the tension in the expedition only grew. The success of this mad campaign rested solely on Cortés's iron will. He ruthlessly suppressed panic and forced the exhausted men to keep going. The Spaniards withstood the first blow of harsh reality. However, an event awaited the expedition ahead for which the Europeans were completely unprepared. However, the situation turned out to be much more complicated than Cortés had expected. The Spaniards' path lay through the harsh lands of Tlaxcala. It was a state of fierce Indian warriors. They hated the Aztecs, but they had no intention of letting the conquistadors pass. Tens of thousands of armed warriors came out to meet the 500 Spaniards. A bloody clash in the narrow mountain valleys became inevitable. The warriors of Tlaxcala fought to take prisoners. They wanted to stun their enemies and drag them to the sacrificial altars. The Indians deliberately avoided fatal blows in the thick of battle. The Spaniards, however, struck with their steel swords only to kill. Cavalry charges and volleys from arquebuses literally tore through the dense ranks.
This brutal European approach quickly broke the Indians' resistance.
After suffering heavy losses, the Tlaxcala leaders made an unexpected decision. They offered Cortés a military alliance against their common enemy, Moctezuma. Thousands of fierce Native American warriors joined the conquistadors' force. They brought the Spaniards corn and became their reliable guides. Cortés was no longer the commander of an isolated detachment. Now he led a vast, vengeful army. The road to Tenochtitlan led through icy mountain passes. The thin air took their breath away, and the snow blinded their eyes. The horses slipped and tumbled into deep rocky gorges. However, the new allies confidently led the conquistadors along secret trails.
They deftly bypassed outposts and ambushes set by the Aztecs.
The combined army relentlessly pressed straight toward the heart of Montezuma's empire. The frightened ruler once again sent messengers to meet Cortés. The Aztecs carried heavy gold discs and precious stones. The emperor begged the Spaniards to take the treasures and turn back, but the glitter of the new gold only fueled the conquistadors' greed. Montezuma never brought himself to engage the enemy in open battle. His attempts to buy off the threat only hastened the empire's downfall. Finally, Cortés' army reached the edge of a vast mountain valley. Below, Lake Texcoco glistened. Standing directly on the water was the majestic Tenochtitlan, the vast capital of the Aztecs. The city was connected to the shore by 3 long, narrow causeways. Deep water protected the capital on all sides. If the Spaniards set foot on these bridges, they would be trapped. But Cortés once again risked the lives of his men. He gave the order to march directly across the stone causeways. The horses struggled to walk on the smooth stones above the dark water. The Spaniards were marching straight into the enemy's lair, trapped on a narrow strip of land. At any moment, the Aztecs could destroy the bridges behind them, and soon this deadly trap would indeed snap shut. The Spaniards stood frozen in amazement. Before them lay Tenochtitlan, a vast city of 300,000 inhabitants. It rose right in the middle of the lake. Only 3 narrow stone causeways led to the capital. Cortés led his men across these bridges. The army stretched out in a long, thin line over the water. If the Indians dismantled the bridges behind them, the Spaniards would find themselves in a deadly trap on the island. Behind the golden temples lay the Aztecs' greatest weakness. All power in the vast country was in the hands of a single man, Montezuma. The provinces obeyed only his direct orders. Cortés quickly realized this flaw.
If they captured the emperor, the vast machinery of the state would simply grind to a halt.
The Spaniards began eagerly studying the streets, the palace guards, and the escape routes. The conquistadors occupied an old palace right in the center of Tenochtitlan. Its thick stone walls made for an excellent fortress. Cortés immediately ordered cannons to be set up at the main gates. Inside the courtyard, soldiers organized round-the-clock guard duty. Day and night, armed crossbowmen patrolled the rooftops. The Spaniards transformed the hospitable palace into a steel-bristled bastion in the midst of a hostile capital. Meanwhile, Montezuma found himself a prisoner of his own traditions. He had welcomed the Spaniards as important guests. The emperor could not simply order their execution without losing face. Cortés interpreted this hesitation as outright weakness. The initiative quickly passed into the hands of the cunning Spanish commander. 400 conquistadors began to dictate terms to the ruler of millions of Indians. In the dark rooms of the palace, Cortés gathered his best captains. They devised a daring and insane plan. The Spaniards decided to take Montezuma hostage right in his own chambers.
If they captured the emperor, the vast machinery of the state would simply grind to a halt.
If the plan worked, the conquistadors would gain control of the entire empire. If they failed, an enraged mob would tear them to pieces. The officers hid their heavy swords under wide cloaks. They made their way to the emperor's residence under the guise of a routine visit. Every Spanish soldier knew his role precisely. The captains entered the hall and slowly surrounded the throne of the unsuspecting Montezuma. There were only seconds left before the catastrophe that would turn the history of an entire continent upside down. The outcome of the entire campaign was decided behind the closed doors of the luxurious palace. A small group of Spanish captains clad in armor entered Montezuma's private chambers. The elite Indian Guard did not dare to stop the distinguished guests. They blindly followed the strict rules of palace etiquette. Thus, a deadly trap snapped shut in the very heart of the impregnable Aztec capital. The interpreter Malinche quietly delivered Cortés' harsh ultimatum. The emperor was to move immediately to the Spanish residence. The words sounded polite, but the captains had already drawn their sharp steel blades. A single shout from the guards would have cost Montezuma his life. The Spaniards exerted enormous psychological pressure on the ruler. The great leader broke and meekly surrendered to a handful of conquistadors. The Europeans' power seemed absolute, but it hung by a thread and depended solely on the authority of a single captive. If the Aztecs had ceased to respect Montezuma, certain death would have awaited the Spaniards. Therefore, Cortés desperately maintained the illusion of normal life at the imperial court. Montezuma continued to receive leaders and issue orders, but behind his back stood armed crossbowmen at all times. Suddenly, Cortés learned of a new threat from the sea. Another detachment of Spaniards had landed on the coast to arrest him. Leaving a small garrison to guard the captive, Cortés rushed toward the ocean. This nighttime forced march became a model of military speed. In the pouring rain, Cortés launched a surprise attack on his rival's camp. The stunned soldiers quickly surrendered and defected to his side. Cortés' army instantly doubled in size. The conquistadors received fresh horses, gunpowder, and new muskets. It seemed that Spanish rule over Mexico would now become absolute. The combined army marched confidently back toward Tenochtitlan. But along the way, Cortés began receiving desperate messages from his garrison. Something terrible was happening in the Aztec capital. While Cortés was away, the situation in the vast city had reached a boiling point. The markets had emptied, and the Spaniards were no longer being supplied with food and water. The fragile peace had collapsed due to a grave mistake by Captain Alvarado, whom Cortés had left in charge. The Spanish officer had issued a single insane order, and that decision had forced hundreds of thousands of enraged Indians to take up arms. While Cortés was fighting on the coast, the Aztecs were preparing for their most sacred festival. The entire elite of the empire had gathered in the square before the great temple. Thousands of unarmed priests and noble warriors danced to the beat of the drums. Captain Pedro de Alvarado watched this huge crowd with horror. He concluded that the Indians were performing a ritual before storming the Spanish palace. The Spanish garrison launched a brutal and sudden attack. Heavily armed soldiers completely blocked all exits from the square. They trapped thousands of dancing Indians in a stone trap. At Alvarado's signal, crossbowmen opened fire directly on the unarmed crowd. Then the conquistadors drew their swords and began mercilessly hacking down the Aztec nobility. This bloody massacre forever changed the history of the New World. In just a few hours, the empire lost its finest military leaders. A vast state was instantly deprived of its experienced rulers. The streets of Tenochtitlan were awash in blood and filled with screams of terror. But the shock quickly gave way to all-consuming fury and a thirst for revenge. The captive Moctezuma had finally lost all power over his people. The Spaniards brought him out onto the palace balcony, demanding that he calm the enraged crowd. But the emperor's appearance only sparked a new wave of hatred. Heavy stones and sharp spears flew at the ruler. One of the cobblestones shattered Montezuma's skull, putting an end to his influence. Soon, the defeated emperor died from his terrible wounds. The Aztecs quickly chose a new, young, and ruthless leader. He immediately declared war on the conquistadors, vowing their complete annihilation. The entire vast city turned into a single deadly machine. Tens of thousands of warriors rushed to storm the Spanish fortifications, continuously bombarding the besieged garrison. It was at that very moment that Cortés returned with a fresh army. The Spaniards marched unhindered through the suspiciously quiet streets of Tenochtitlan. They calmly entered the courtyard of the central palace. But this was a brilliant tactical ruse by the Indians. As soon as Cortés led all his troops inside, the Aztecs slammed the trap shut. A huge arsenal of weapons and hundreds of horses proved completely useless. In the cramped courtyard, the cavalry simply could not maneuver to attack. Gunpowder supplies dwindled rapidly with every new volley. Soon, the besieged conquistadors were left without food or fresh water. Cortés realized that his invincible army was doomed to an agonizing death. The Aztecs quickly figured out how to destroy the Spaniards in the narrow alleys. They deliberately destroyed the stone bridges on the causeways. Tenochtitlan turned into a network of isolated islands. The Spanish cavalry became completely useless. The horses simply lacked the space to gather speed and launch a deadly charge. Now the conquistadors had to fight tooth and nail for every meter of ground. To escape the hail of stones, Cortés ordered the construction of siege towers. Carpenters hastily assembled heavy wooden shelters on wheels. Arquebusiers hid inside and returned fire through narrow embrasures. But thousands of furious Indians stopped these unwieldy machines with brute force. The city's defenders instantly erected new barricades of thick logs in the streets. The Aztecs completely controlled the flat roofs of the houses. Heavy boulders and sharp spears rained down on the Spaniards from above. The stones easily pierced the soldiers' sturdy wooden shields. The Spanish archers simply could not keep up with reloading their heavy weapons. Any attempt to venture beyond the palace walls resulted in dozens of Cortés's men being killed or wounded. The conquistadors decided to flee under cover of darkness. A cold, torrential rain fell that night. The Spaniards tightly wrapped cloth around their horses' hooves to muffle the clatter of the horseshoes. A massive column of thousands of soldiers and allies slowly moved through the thick fog. Cortez's vanguard successfully reached the start of the Tlaxcala Dam, their only hope of escape. But it proved impossible to conceal the movement of an entire army. Aztec sentries spotted suspicious shadows near the canals. Huge signal drums began to rumble ominously over the lake. Priests summoned thousands of warriors to the breach. The water around the narrow dam instantly turned black with hundreds of war canoes. The quiet escape turned into a bloody nighttime slaughter on a narrow strip of land. The Spaniards carried a heavy portable bridge with them for the crossing. But after the first group passed, it became firmly stuck in the deep silt. The column of conquistadors came to a halt before a wide black chasm. A terrible stampede began on the dam. The Aztecs fired point blank at the crowd from their light boats. The organized retreat turned into sheer terror and a panicked stampede. In the darkness under the downpour, the Spanish formation completely fell apart. Soldiers threw away heavy gold and pushed their comrades into the icy water. The commander's orders were drowned out by the dying screams and furious howls of the Indians. That night, Tenochtitlan claimed hundreds of lives, but the most terrible ordeal awaited the survivors at dawn. That night went down in history as the Night of Sorrow. A veritable bloodbath began on the narrow Tlaxcala causeway. Trapped on all sides, the Spaniards jumped into the cold water in a panic. They desperately tried to swim across the wide gaps in the destroyed bridges. Heavy steel cuirasses and looted gold inexorably dragged the soldiers to the muddy bottom. In pitch darkness, the conquistadors blindly slashed with their swords at both enemies and their own allies. Cortés abandoned the heavy cannons and precious gunpowder on the dam forever. Frightened horses slipped on the wet stones and plunged into the Black Lake. They dragged the armored horsemen down with them to the bottom. The Aztecs in their light boats completely cut off and destroyed the Spanish rearguard. Only those conquistadors who had been at the very front of the column and managed to reach the shore survived. The wounded remnants of Cortés' army began an exhausting, non-stop march. They desperately made their way to the lands of their loyal allies in the harsh region of Tlaxcala. The route lay through hostile territories loyal to the new Aztec emperor. The conquistadors had no food, no medicine, and no dry gunpowder charges left. The unit's survival depended solely on speed. The Spaniards tried to avoid any open clashes with Indian patrols. But after a few days, a massive army of pursuers caught up with the fugitives. On the Otumba plain, a handful of exhausted Spaniards were surrounded by tens of thousands of fresh Aztec warriors. The situation seemed utterly hopeless. Then Cortés gathered the remnants of his cavalry for a final, desperate charge. 20 Spanish horsemen cut a bloody path straight through the center of the enemy formation. They killed the Aztec commander-in-chief, and the massive Indian army scattered in panic. Upon reaching his allies, Cortés began planning a ruthless revenge. He ordered carpenters to design 13 maneuverable wooden brigantines. The Spaniards built these ships deep in the forest to hide them from spies. Then thousands of Native American porters carried the disassembled vessels on their shoulders to the lake. This fleet was intended to completely blockade the island capital from the water. Cortés had taken all his past fatal mistakes into account. Meanwhile, a veritable apocalypse had begun in Tenochtitlan itself. What steel swords could not accomplish, an invisible threat did. One of Cortés's slaves brought the smallpox virus to the continent. The disease began to rapidly decimate the population of the vast metropolis. Thousands of bodies lay in the streets, and there was simply no one left to defend the capital. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and the great Aztec Empire was doomed. While the wounded Spaniards were being treated in Tlaxcala, smallpox struck the rebellious capital. This terrible disease rapidly decimated the densely populated areas of Tenochtitlan. The Indians had no immunity to the European contagion. In just a few weeks, the streets of the vast city turned into a vast graveyard. The capital's squares emptied, and the great empire was once again plunged into chaos. The young and resolute Emperor Cuauhtémoc was among the first to contract smallpox. He died in agony in his luxurious palace. The vast empire lost its strong leader on the very eve of the decisive battle. Under such conditions, there was simply no one left to rally the Aztec army. At that time, Cortés launched 13 warships onto Lake Texcoco. The ship's cannons shattered the light Indian canoes carrying provisions. The Spaniards completely cut off all of Tenochtitlan's supply routes. They destroyed the stone aqueduct, leaving hundreds of thousands of Aztecs without a drop of fresh water. The besieged Indians found themselves trapped on the island, beset by hunger and disease. Finally, Cortés gave the order for a general assault. The Spaniards struck all three dams simultaneously. Brigantines covered the infantry's flanks with a barrage of fire from heavy cannons. The conquistadors advanced very slowly. They mercilessly demolished every house from which enemy stones were hurled. Only by razing the city to the ground could the Spaniards avoid deadly ambushes in the narrow alleys. Day after day, the conquistadors tightened their iron ring around the vast Tlatelolco market. The exhausted defenders ate tree bark, but continued to launch fierce counterattacks. The great capital slowly vanished under the blows of Spanish pickaxes and cannonballs. The once beautiful city on the lake was inexorably turning into a heap of smoking ruins. The once magnificent city on the lake had turned into a vast stone graveyard. The Spaniards methodically demolished the palaces and temples down to their very foundations. They threw the heavy rubble of the buildings directly into the deep canals. Soon, the water was completely hidden beneath piles of broken stone. This is how Cortés created solid ground for the deadly attacks of his cavalry. The Aztecs were forever deprived of their main defense, the life-saving water. Along with the Spaniards, tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan people rushed toward the city center. These Indian tribes had hated the Aztecs' cruel rule for centuries. Now the time had come for their terrible and bloody revenge. Cortés's allies mercilessly finished off the wounded defenders of the capital. Great Tenochtitlan was destroyed by the very people who, until recently, had obediently paid tribute to it. The vast northern market of Tlatelolco became the last line of defense. The Aztecs had turned the market stalls into a tangled maze of barricades. It was here that the most brutal hand-to-hand combat of the entire war erupted. The new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, personally led his exhausted warriors into the attack. He desperately tried to save what remained of his dying people. But steel swords and muskets left the Indians no chance at all. The Spanish infantry charged to the deafening roar of the ship's cannons. Heavy cannonballs shattered the last line of the Indians' defense. The conquistadors cut the crowd of defenders into small, isolated groups. The Aztecs' organized resistance finally collapsed. Now the exhausted warriors fought to the death alone amid the smoking ruins. The end of the months-long siege was already inevitable. Cortés offered Cuauhtémoc one last chance to surrender and spare his life. But the proud ruler flatly refused to bow his head before the invaders. He decided to stand his ground with weapons in hand until the very end. His bravery held the last elite Eagle warriors in their positions. They defended a tiny patch of land, tightly surrounded by corpses and enemies. But they no longer had a single arrow left to fight with. On the final day of the siege, the Spaniards launched a decisive assault from all sides. The resistance of the great empire was finally broken. The defenders fell to the ground not so much from well-aimed shots as from monstrous hunger and utter exhaustion. Emperor Cuauhtémoc realized that the capital was finally doomed. Under the cover of thick smoke, he attempted to flee the ruins in a fleet of fast canoes. The ruler wanted to reach the northern mountains and raise a new army, but a Spanish brigantine spotted the boats in time and completely cut off their retreat. The conquistadors took the last Aztec leader captive. At that moment, the mighty empire ceased to exist forever. News of the emperor's capture spread instantly through the smoking ruins of Tlatelolco. Exhausted defenders silently threw their spears onto the blood-soaked stones. An eerie silence hung over the dead lake, broken only by the weeping of women. The vast city, which for centuries had held millions of Indians in fear, had finally fallen. Steel swords and European gunpowder had forever altered the fate of an entire continent. The once flourishing valley had turned into a vast mass grave. The surviving Aztecs, emaciated by terrible famine, wandered en masse away from the ruined capital. They tried to take refuge in the wild mountains and dense forests. The Spaniards had seized vast territories, but now only emptiness reigned here. Cortés was left with a dead, charred wasteland. The conquistadors had to spend years clearing the rubble and building a new city literally from scratch. The fall of Tenochtitlan triggered a bloody chain reaction throughout Central America. Spanish cavalry units scattered in all directions, brutally subjugating neighboring tribes. The Europeans imposed their will solely through muskets and fear. Soon the Indians of Tlaxcala realized with horror the fatal mistake they had made. By helping Cortés destroy the empire, they had simply traded one ruthless master for another. There is no room for romantic chivalric legends in the history of this war. A small band of conquistadors marched forward, driven solely by a thirst for gold and absolute power. The Spaniards constantly resorted to trickery, broke treaties, and cold-bloodedly massacred entire cities. Incredible cruelty became their primary weapon of war. And so a handful of desperate men wiped the greatest civilization of the New World off the face of the earth forever. The echoes of those bloody battles still resonate in the streets of modern Mexico. On the shattered stones of the great Indian pyramids, the Spaniards erected their massive Catholic cathedrals. The conquistadors took local women as wives, forever mixing the blood of two warring continents. From the ashes of the burned-down Tenochtitlan, a completely new, brutal, and astonishing civilization was born. Today we followed in the footsteps of a small Spanish expedition that forever redrew the map of the world. Which other great empire would you like to learn about in the next video? Share your ideas in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new historical chronicles.